You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Will Hamas agree to the United States ceasefire proposal, and has Israel actually done so? Does the EU need a defence commissioner, and does anybody want the job? And have German children been led astray by an elephant? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests, Jonathan Fenby and Marion Messmer, will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll have live music from Leah Saudi of Fat White Family. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Jonathan Fenby, former editor of the South China Morning Post and author of several books, at least one of which is almost certainly going to get seamlessly plugged as the show goes on, and by Dr. Marion Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
And Jonathan, we will start with an opportunity for you to plug a book, because you have recently been to France, and this is a reasonable enough book plug, as the subject of France is probably going to emerge at various junctures during the show, but you have written at least one book on the subject.
I've written four books, actually, about France.
Are they all available in good stores?
They're all available in good stores or online or in any other way you want to, or address yourself to me if you really need one. A signed copy.
Which part of France were you most recently in? Was it a hotbed of National Rally sympathies?
The answer to the first is we were in the Périgord region. Actually, it was in the Quercy. It's down below the Dordogne, where all the Brits live, towards the Lot department. Very rural. And at the village festival, which was there 3 days while we were in residence, the people didn't seem to be very interested in politics at all. I tried to conjure up several conversations during the mass eating of paella and charcuterie, apple tart and other things, and the drinking of local wines, and nobody seemed to be in the least interested. The mayor, who is a man with an absolutely superb handlebar moustache,
one would hope so, was
more concerned about when the cafe would be finished in the village, which he thinks will bring a lot of passing trade. But that was his concern. Now, if Marine Le Pen can promise that cafe will be finished more quickly under her, well, she's got his vote.
Well, excellent food, wine, views, and a complete lack of interest in the EU elections. It sounds fabulous. Marion, you have recently been on an actual road trip in the Republic of Ireland, about which I am also incandescently jealous, because that is a splendid way to spend time.
It was really beautiful. I mean, unfortunately, I've not written any books about Ireland, so clearly that's career goals ahead of me. But I had a really wonderful time, and I got to see a lot of different landscapes that were all very beautiful.
Was there one in particular that stuck out, one that you would recommend to our listeners?
They're all really different, so I don't want to necessarily pick favourites, but I was really struck by the mountains in the Galway region and the sort of lake area there. I thought that was really beautiful.
An absolutely appropriate answer. Beautiful part of the world. Big hello to our many listeners, I'm sure, in County Galway. We will have more from you both shortly, but we will be starting in the Middle East. And yesterday, the UN Security Council voted aye on a US resolution outlining the framework of a ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution's text said Israel had already accepted the deal proposed by President Joe Biden in May, which is more wishful thinking than verifiable reality, and is intended to both corner Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and, if we can all forgive the mixed metaphor, bat the ball into Hamas's court. Well, I'm joined now by Hannah McCarthy, a journalist based in Jerusalem. Hannah, people have been trying to figure out all day if Hamas have accepted this deal or will accept this deal. What is the latest?
Again, what we have is a positive reception from the Hamas group. That's the kind of framing that we're getting towards the deal. But we don't have a concrete acceptance from Yahya Sinwar, who is the military leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So that's what we're waiting for. And again, we have a slight ambiguity as to whether Netanyahu has expressly accepted this deal or not. What we're hearing is that Blinken has said he did have an assurance from Netanyahu that they would accept the deal, but we haven't actually had a public statement from Netanyahu, although Netanyahu is famously good at dodging these types of statements where he has to put forward a clear direction or make a statement that could engender a bad reception from the right-wing element of his coalition.
I mean, is there a reason why Hamas would not accept this deal? It does lay out a near-term ceasefire and a permanent cessation of hostilities after that. It does call for massive investment to undertake the obviously very necessary rebuilding of Gaza. Isn't that all things Hamas would want, or do they perhaps fear that at some point in this process they're going to get completely frozen out of it?
In theory, the deal offers, I think, what Hamas broadly want. I think one of the issues and questions for them is, are they convinced that this deal will be guaranteed, that if Israel breaches one of the parts of the deal, that there will be consequences, or that the international community, in particular the US, will step in order to safeguard the deal? Because that's the question. If it's, again, the US has not shown maybe a strong willingness to rein in support for Israel so far. So in the event of a breach of one of the deals, that is kind of the question. How trust is always a big part of these deals.
Well, let's look at this from the other side then. The very text of the resolution the US put to and actually got through the Security Council says that Israel has agreed to it. But you're quite right that we've heard nothing of that in public from Benjamin Netanyahu. Politically, can he agree to this deal? Does he not risk losing the remaining support he has, i.e. from the ultra hawks with whom he has formed a governing coalition?
So, I mean, much of the last year has been Netanyahu trying to hold on to power, and we may be coming towards the end of that. The reality is the other parties in Israel don't have a strong interest in going into a coalition government with these right-wing members of Netanyahu's government. Do they have a ton of opportunities other than sticking with Netanyahu? Other people would say they don't really, particularly after Benny Gantz left the coalition government. At the same time, if they do leave, it's certainly going to force elections, but that point is already kind of closing in on Netanyahu with the exodus of Benny Gantz and the other moderate members of his coalition government.
And I guess another consideration for everybody involved in making these decisions on the Israeli side is who thinks they have Israeli public opinion behind them. And I know that there have been those huge demonstrations against Netanyahu continuing. Those were a thing even before Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. But is it possible to be certain about where Israeli public opinion is now on the prospects of a ceasefire in Gaza?
So again, there's been different pollings done throughout the war. What we know for certain is the vast majority of Israel is in support of some sort of ceasefire in exchange for the hostages. And again, there is strong support for Netanyahu leaving government, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily equate to, a full peace deal and a complete end to the war. There's definitely an appetite within the Israeli public to continue some sort of war. And there is not a huge amount of support for something like a Palestinian state. And again, one of the kind of points that has come up in the deal is that it's not quite clear yet to what extent Hamas will be involved in the post war governance structure, because this has been one of the sticking points. Israel, since the start of the war, has said they must annihilate Hamas, while other analysts and figures within the Palestinian movement have said it's not possible to have some sort of government that doesn't have some element of Hamas. One, because it has some sort of legitimacy with the public, but two, because if you don't bring Hamas into the government, you keep them outside and you create the conditions in which you can continue to have an insurgency that endangers the very government that you're trying to create in Gaza.
Hannah McCarthy in Jerusalem, thank you for joining us. Let's bring in our panel now, Jonathan Fenby and Marion Messmer. Jonathan, I think this is probably one of those situations where what we don't know vastly outweighs what we do, but nevertheless, do you perceive anywhere in here the beginning of the end, at least?
I'm afraid not. I'm pretty pessimistic about this. There are a lot of ambiguities, as we said. Blinken is obviously, has tied his future, in a sense, to coming up with some kind of agreement. But what we know of this ceasefire deal leaves so many things unspoken. For instance, from the Netanyahu Israeli government point of view, the repeated insistence on eliminating, destroying Hamas, which again they were talking about today, ministers were talking about today, and from Hamas's side, the insistence on eliminating Israel and the existence of Israel. And I don't see how you bring those two together on any lasting way. You may have a short-term ceasefire, but it's not going to solve any of the basic problems.
Marion, Jonathan outlines one fairly fundamental conundrum there, which is that neither Israel nor Hamas are terribly keen on each other existing. But it strikes me that part 3 of Biden's peace plan is going to be the trickiest one of the lot, which is this idea of this vast Marshall Plan-style rebuilding program for Gaza. Now, granted, that is going to be necessary, but it is going to cost a fortune, and it is going to have to be a fortune spent and work done in probably suboptimal circumstances. Is it clear to you where that money and where that investment and where that risk is going to come from? Who is going to want anything to do with this?
It's a really good question. It's unfortunately not clear to me, and I'm not sure that the Biden administration has a clear plan for that either. And the other question that comes up when looking at that is, what would that look like in terms of a Palestinian state? Is that the future we're traveling towards, or would this essentially just be, a Palestinian territory that Israel in effect has control over? And the rebuilding of infrastructure is, of course, a key factor in deciding control. So I think there are a lot of things that can't really be decided about how Gaza will be rebuilt until some questions about the governance and administration have also been decided, and that will be so tricky to do.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that to put it in a negative way, and I seem to be taking the negative corner here, Israel will want control over any rebuilding of Gaza. Hamas equally will want control, and neither will admit the other. And how Biden, facing an election, already spending an awful lot of money at home and on Ukraine, with the government deficit going up, how this is going to be financed, I don't know. I mean, the difference with the Marshall Plan was that everybody in Western Europe welcomed the Marshall Plan at the time, which is always forgotten about.
As everybody in Ukraine will welcome the reconstruction of Ukraine.
But also there were American troops remained in Europe at the time as a kind of security guarantee. Now, none of that is going to apply in Gaza.
Well, let's move along, and especially since the United Kingdom flounced from the EU, there has been a tendency for France and Germany to see themselves as the default captains of the project, France very much seeing the relationship as that of pilot and co-pilot. However, both of these pillars, if pillars they are, of the EU are presently looking somewhat wobbly. President Emmanuel Macron of France has called a somewhat startling early election for the National Assembly, effectively inviting the far right to come and have a go if it thinks it's hard enough. Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany has rejected calls to do something similar on the grounds that he would nigh certainly lose. Marion, is it at this point overly judgmental to see either or both Macron and Scholz as essentially lame ducks?
I think it's too early to say, because in France, I think the hope is that the election will turn out differently to the results of the European election, which I think is why Macron is undertaking this gamble. Whereas in Germany, I think it's unlikely that an election would be called because of the differences in the parliamentary systems, insofar as that, as you mentioned, Scholz would be much more likely to lose, whereas Macron is going to remain president, even if his party were to lose a parliamentary election. So for that reason, it's not in the current German coalition's interest in calling for an election, but the coalition has been beset by a range of issues for a long time now, and I think it's much more the infighting of those three parties that has resulted in a lot of the discontent and has also actually given the CDU, CSU a very strong platform from which to essentially challenge the government, because we shouldn't forget that they were actually in power until very recently, and people were not too happy with their work either, which is what resulted in the current coalition. And yet they're challenging from an opposition position as if, they didn't have a very long track record in government that also did not end too well.
Jonathan, Macron's gamble is a big one, and it's been interesting to see how it has shaken out since he announced it. He may have been a bit surprised by this idea that there would be an alliance between the National Rally and the Republicans, the more mainstream Conservative Party. That said, he may be less surprised by the fact that upon being presented with this idea, the Republicans have begun imploding.
Yes, well, the whole Macron story, going back 7 years now, is that of destroying other parties. And he's achieved his end, which may have been unintended at the time, of making the National Rally, Le Pen's party, the main opposition party. And he shouldn't be surprised now if the Socialists, the Republicans and others, who basically he's cut the legs from under over the last 7 years, don't exactly rush to back him up. Mind you, I was listening to him. He did a long television interview on D-Day last week, where and again in his statement after the European elections, he's kind of positing the French election, as a great existential moment of, are you for the hard right or against the hard right? Are you for Ukraine, against supporting Ukraine, and so on and so on, and aligning it with D-Day and 1944 and the struggle in Europe against Nazi Germany. From my recent experience on the ground and what all the polls say, the French voters do not see it that way. They are concerned about the cost of living, about immigration, about agricultural prices, about law and order in the cities, and so on. And they basically couldn't give a fig about this high-level Jupiterian debate, which Macron wants to have.
Just to follow that up quickly, Jonathan, is Macron, do you think, trying to break this cycle, which now does seem to have been going on for decades, of basically every French national political contest coming down to not a contest of how better to improve our country, how better to run public services, but are we going to elect fascists or not elect fascists? I mean, this goes back to, I think, the presidential election between Jacques Chirac and Marion Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, 2002, when even Chirac's own supporters put up posters saying, vote for the crook, not the fascist.
Exactly. There. But I mean, what she has done, and I think she's done brilliantly politically, Marine Le Pen, she's, as it were, de-diabolized, to use the phrase used about her in France, the National Front and the far right. And she's seen as a kind of friendly mother-in-law to the country, with the young leader of the party, Bardella, as the kind of bright young energetic young man who will stand up to Macron's stand-in, the energetic Attal Prime Minister. So you've got a real... This is not Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the bruiser who would get into the ring and took an absolute pleasure in being controversial, being anti-Semitic, being racist, and so on. He loved it. I went to many of his rallies, and you could see him winding himself up the whole time. Marine is the opposite, and she's calmed things down. And I think for many people in France, and I hesitate to say this, she actually represents a kind of stability at the moment, as against Macron shooting off with these great grand ideas.
Marion, to introduce another French phrase into the conversation, this is the cordon sanitaire, which is this idea, and this is what we're seeing those Republicans who are unkeen on the National Rally talking about, this idea that there are some parties where, okay, so people voted for them, but however, even if it is to our advantage, we will not deal with these people. They are beyond the pale, and it has been applied very much so to Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Are we beginning to see, though, mainstream parties trying to weasel their way out of those, or realising perhaps that if people are voting for these people, we are going to have to deal with them.
I think, unfortunately, we are seeing a weakening of that kind of attitude, both in terms of formerly more centrist or more mainstream parties adopting more right-wing policies, but also in terms of there being a rejection of making those absolutist claims. What we have seen so far, both in France and Germany, is that actually tends to weaken the conservative parties that make those statements. We had similar fallouts in the Conservative Party in Germany before the last elections, and I think we're seeing inklings of similar in France now, where the politicians that are willing to ally themselves with the far right actually meet with resistance in their own party and are not necessarily that popular. But in a way, splitting the centre conservative parties up in that way also then emboldens the far right parties because they can seem much more united in that way. So I think it's very concerning in terms of the political direction in Europe. And we see similar things happening across Europe, really. So I think France and Germany are not the only countries that have those kind of challenges at the moment.
Well, sticking with the EU election and the consequences, easy for me to say, thereof, it does seem likelier than not that Ursula von der Leyen will get another go-round as European Commission President. This will give her the chance to make good on a pre-election promise to create a new post as of EU Defence Commissioner. It seems like a reasonable enough idea, what with Europe being menaced in a manner not seen since the Cold War, or if you tend toward a bleaker analysis still, the 1930s. What is less clear, however, is what the holder of such an office would actually do. Jonathan, does creating this post seem an example of what is often termed the politician's fallacy? Something must be done, this is something, therefore we must do it.
I'm not sure that people think something must be done. Something must be done, clearly, on coordinating, having a better organised EU European defence position, as we've seen over Ukraine. But whether actually appointing a commissioner for that will mean anything, given that each country within the EU will want to keep its own defence minister and its own defence power. So what does the defence minister, the commissioner, do? He calls meetings of the defence ministers of individual countries and hopes they come up with something that he can then present as being EU policy. So it's pretty thin.
And also, Marion, acknowledging that not every member of the EU is a member of NATO and vice versa, but does this seem like anything that NATO's Secretary-General isn't doing already?
So the EU and NATO recently actually have managed to delineate their defence responsibilities in a much better way than they traditionally have done. I mean, of course, on the face of it, they have been coordinating on defence for a long time, but they have also often stepped on each other's toes or not been quite clear about who should do what. But since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the split has been more or less that the EU looks after the defence industry and tries to coordinate European defence industries a little more, which makes sense given the EU's trade role and the common market, whereas NATO has looked much more after the hard defence questions and coordinated member states along those lines. I have heard people talk about the defence commissioner essentially having a big trade portfolio and being very responsible for coordinating industry, which I could see being more useful than someone who, just calls meetings of defence ministers. But at the same time, I'm also wondering whether it wouldn't be better to spend the budget that would go for the commissioner's salary and office into a bigger program to actually bring European defence industry together. Because, as we've discussed on and off on the Daily, there's a lot that needs to be done in that regard. And the European failure to mobilize its defense industry in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is ongoing and is actually a pretty big security risk. So there's a lot that could be done there, whether it should be a commissioner to do it or rather a different set of activities that has perhaps a little more teeth behind them is the question.
Jonathan, there have been some names bandied about as to people who might be suitable for this position. Poland's Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Lithuania's Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis, two of them guests on Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, repeatedly. But if you were either of them, all of whom do have pretty good jobs as it is, would you want this one?
No. No.
Do you, Jonathan Fenby, in fact, want this job?
Well, I haven't yet put in for it, yeah. Let's say. I'm not sure I have the credentials. No, but individual strong defence people, ministers, would want to stay on, I think, to the national job. And there's another question beyond this, which is what happens to France's nuclear power? France's nuclear bomb. France is the only country with nuclear arms in the EU
and NATO,
and NATO. And would they not in the EU? And would they they put the French force de frappe under this commissioner? No.
And just finally on this one, Marion, will this, and this will probably be incredibly irritating if it does, but will it revive the perennial chatter about should there be an EU army?
I think the EU army is one of those topics that just keeps coming up and dying down. It's vaguely follows a sine curve, I think. So it's something that will undoubtedly come up again. I don't think that anyone will suggest I hope no one will suggest putting the EU Defence Commissioner in charge of the EU army. So I don't think that we will get a revision of that. What I thought you were going to say was whether there was going to be an EU nuclear weapons program, because that's also something that we talked about in the last 6 months. I don't think that will happen either, just to put any suggestions there to bed. But I think both of those topics will keep coming up because they touch on what's at the heart of European defence. But I don't think that either of those two things are a good idea.
Well, to Germany now, where a cartoon elephant, incongruously, if not downright unrealistically dressed in red shirt and cap and blue trousers, has been crushed by the remorseless juggernaut of modern progressive thought. Terror!
Benjamin, du lieber Elefant, kannst sprechen und bist überall bekannt.
Terror! Benjamin Blümchen, for it is he, has been for some decades a common motif of a German daycare centre, outlet chain, consortium, etc. But no more. The cheery pachyderm's habit of hoovering up sugar cubes with his trunk has been deemed a poor example nutrition-wise, and Benjamin Blümchen has been accordingly ushered to the knacker's yard. Marion, has at any point your consumption of sugar been influenced by a cartoon elephant with a, sweet tooth, a sweet tusk, if you will?
I don't think so. So I actually love Benjamin Blümchen. It was probably one of the most listened to cassettes in our family car, probably much to my parents' chagrin.
Your parents must have been delighted.
Yep. My brother and I definitely went through a phase where we asked for, each cassette to be listened to several times on the same car journey. But I have to say, when I was researching for this story, which is a funny sentence in itself, I couldn't remember what his favorite snack was, and I had to go to Wikipedia to remember that it was sugar cubes. So that's not what stuck in my mind from those cassettes. Did
you, for those of us like myself who are coming fresh to the Benjamin Blümchen phenomenon, did you own a great deal of merchandise? Was there a branded lunchbox, T-shirts, pillowcases? I don't know.
There undoubtedly was. We had absolutely masses of those cassettes. There was also a parallel storyline about a little witch, where we also had a lot of those cassettes. There's some crossover episodes. I think we might have...
Did the witch eat sugar?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
Did she have a more fiendish kind of diet?
Maybe she was healthier. I mean, I remember a lot of flying around on a broomstick. So maybe she was the sportier one of the two.
Witches will do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Jonathan, is it asking a bit much for a cartoon elephant to be a health and fitness paragon?
I think it's completely ridiculous there. This reminds me, rather, going back to my own childhood, of things like Billy Bunter and Desperate Dan, who would eat 100 meat pies at a sitting and so on. None of those actually influence one's own diet.
No, well, just thinking back to the childhood totems of my own upbringing, Marion, I did not at any point, despite being a huge fan of Mr. Squiggle, and I do enjoin people to look him up, I did not want to get in a rocket ship and fly to the moon and draw pictures with my nose. Or actually, now that I say all that out loud...
You did.
I do kind of fancy all of that. So maybe it is an influence. But we did want to open this up finally to talking about things which we were raised on in terms of children's entertainment, which may now seem a bit weird. And I will start with you, Marion, because that was obviously much more recent for you than it was for me or Jonathan. I mean, apart from the elephant you don't remember eating sugar, were there other sort of totems of a German childhood which, when you think back on them, kind of cause you to wonder, what the hell were we watching?
Two. So one is very German, so you may not have heard of it, which is Karl May and his Winnetou universe, which is like a completely made-up Western story, which it turns out is like incredibly racist and does not portray, Native American life well at all in any way. And the other one, which you may be familiar with, is Enid Blyton, whose books I also read a lot of, and it's about a lot of, it's about groups of children being basically left to roam the countryside wild and, fall into caves and have lots of adventures, which are probably not the safest in hindsight.
And Jonathan, other than Billy Bunter?
Well, there were all those comics, the Dandy and the Beano, with the Bash Street Kids and others, who were all pretty subversive. But I don't think that actually led us to go out and throw stones through windows and so on. And then there was Rupert Bear, who I couldn't stand, who was goody-goody, of course.
Oh, no one liked Rupert Bear.
No, we never liked goody-goodies, do we?
No.
So you liked the bad, subversive characters, but I'm not sure they actually influenced your behaviour.
I would like to also add, or at least recommend to listeners, that as soon as they have done listening to this show, they set aside some time and embark down the YouTube rabbit hole of The Muppet Show, because, my God, that was strange. The one that I always recommend people starting with, when they had Kenny Rogers on singing his great hit, The Gambler, which he duetted opposite a Muppet version of The Gambler, who not only smokes and drinks as per the song, but also dies as per the song, and then his ghost rises out of the Muppet and capers around the train compartment.
Well, we have Miss Piggy, of course, who was a great symbol, and she was a kind of role model to some people. Violent. She was pretty violent, that's it.
Well, on that thought, Jonathan Fenby and Marion Messmer, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, live music. Every album by Fat White Family has seemed like it might be their last, a reflection of the spectacular musical drama captured on their records and of the group's well-chronicled personnel crises. Fat White Family's new album, Forgiveness Is Yours, sounds, for various reasons, more like it might be their last than any of its predecessors, and is therefore arguably somewhat ironically titled. Fat White Family's Lias Saudi came to Midori House earlier. I began by asking about a recent social media posting of his, suggesting that the band had now had 117 different lineups, and asked whether there was a spreadsheet of some sort to help him keep track.
There was a spreadsheet around the time that we were doing the book, when I was doing the book with Adele. I think there was a bit at the back that was like those who served, like a list. So we did actually try and compile it, and you'd wake up in fright, thinking, God, have I forgotten thingamajig, I think it was around 67 then, and that was a couple of years ago.
As listeners coming to you new may not be aware, there is quite the history of fallings in and fallings out among Fat White Family. Are you able to regard that at this point as an actually helpful process of, creative destruction, or does it just all become a bit of a pest?
It's a nightmare. It's been a never-ending, nightmare. And not in a kind of, I guess, you make your bed, you lie in it, I think we did everything wrong. And at the time, that seemed like a good idea. And then suddenly you're in your, mid-30s, You've drifted too far from the shore, as they say. And
it's too late to go back now. You mentioned the memoir that came out reasonably recently. This is called 10,000 Apologies, the subtitle Fat White Family and the Miracle of Failure. When you told the whole story to yourself all over again, incredible though it is, did you feel like you'd learned anything from the process of putting that book together? Or I guess, was there any aspect of telling your own story to yourself which kind of surprised you?
I think if you render yourself like a spectator of your own life, it's a good way of kind of trying to get out of a bit of a pickle, I think it's a good way of curing yourself of certain situations. Because the absurdity of it, the embarrassment of it, the kind of shame of it, it kind of multiplies all that. It makes it unavoidable. The comfortable kind of delusions you started out with are shed because you've turned them into a kind of literally into a song and dance.
But this is a recurring motif, not just, I think, of Fat White Family's music, but also of your own extracurricular writing, in that you have acquired for yourself what is, to most people, one of the great dream jobs. You're the lead singer in a successful rock group, and you seem to have, well, the longer you go on, the more mixed your feelings seem to become.
I mean, I just don't think there is like a kind of one successful. I think I would struggle to use that word. I think it's kind of like...
relative to like what becomes of almost every band who ever starts out, what you have accomplished is wildest dreams plus tax.
I mean, I think that's not taking into account the cost, the human cost, the psychological cost, you know, the emotional cost, the moral cost, and what it does to your relationships and everything else. You know, it's obliterated so many lives, I think, this group. And not in a kind of like, oh, we're so kind of naughty, you know. It's like it's genuinely kind of like sifting through like rubble most of the time, and it's not like anybody makes a great deal of money out of it, you know. So it's like it's more sacrificial than that. I think it's kind of one of those things that I honestly wouldn't wish it on most people. I honestly wouldn't. It's kind of like claustrophobic, weird, alienating, just damages you in so many ways. I think other than being maybe like in the military or something, what could be worse for your mental health than going on tour? You know?
I do recall you wrote about something to this effect, that there's that one night, the first time everything falls together for you. Like you go out leading your band, and for whatever reason, everybody there that night loves it, and you never ever recover from that. Is that what it's felt like to you, that you're always chasing that first high, as it were?
I don't really understand where that kind of inclination in me came from as like a performer, because it's not my natural kind of mode as a human being. I was very, very shy and always was quite shy. And something about being in front of an audience or whatever, that's like the scariest thing imaginable for me, you know. But it kind of triggered something in me that I really had no idea was there. But it's incredibly addictive. But it's a mystery to me why and how that kind of came to be. But I guess that's kind of what still happens. I still get an absolute kick out of it. There's other things in my life I'm interested in. I'm not sure if I could ever fully give that up. But the particular psychodrama of the Fat White Family is something that's kind of, it's non-tenable. Because, I mean, and hence the 67, between 67 and 117 members. I think it's just not, it doesn't work explicitly.
I mean, it would be both a large and lively reunion party, certainly, but all of your albums tend to get reviewed almost on the assumption that they're going to be Fat White Family's last album. Does this one feel any more or less than usual like that to you?
I think key members have departed. I think my kind of lifestyle, my kind of, I don't know, ambitions or whatever you want to call it, things I will put up with have shifted dramatically since writing the book, since the pandemic.
In what kind of way?
Just like way, way, way less interested in getting completely out of my mind on drugs all the time.
I do recall that your co-author Adele Stripe described your band as a drug band with a rock problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where she stole that line from, but I mean, I've heard it enough.
If it's an original coinage, it's an absolute ripper.
I mean, let's just say that it is, for Adele's sake. Let's just say that it is, you know. I don't know, I just go out, I'm 38 now, you know. It's been 12 years since we started the group, and you can just go in your mid-20s. I don't know, like, friends of mine, there's a fork in the road, and there's a bunch of people going down this way, you know. And most of them have just continued to kind of batter their heads in with the same old stuff, you know. And you just start to lose your mind. Like, your grip on reality starts to kind of shrivel, and I'm just not into that, you know.
Have you reached that point of wondering, is this really what I want to do forever?
I think it's kind of irrelevant what I do, I will feel like that. It doesn't matter what I do, you know. My thing is I'm kind of crippled with indecision. I really struggle with indecision. I can never make my mind up about anything, whether it's relationships or work or jobs, or, you know, I'll start writing an essay, then I'll start another one, then I'll think it's the greatest thing on earth 1 minute, and then I'm just plunged. You know, I go from like wild confidence to manic self-doubt in the course of an hour and back again. Like, I have no consistency with anything, so I can't say.
Well, on that ambivalent note, please, if you would, introduce the song you're going to do for us.
I'm going to do Religion for One, which is off of the new album, but this is kind of the acoustic kind of bare bones thing, kind of folky thing that it comes from.
You are what you sacrifice, amalgam of pain. Should your misplaced foresight lead you to my door again? Roll out them shekels, baby, spit out that gum, my conscience dissipating. Your vanity's firstborn runt, just a cat drinking its own reflection. Religion for one. Your fear of failure and ambition, the same thing. You will never get a table at the Dorsia within. Finish off this pedicure, redirect the blame. Your armor's protecting nothing. You're not the picture, not even the frame, just a dog drinking up my reflection. You're squandering pain.
And that was Lias Saudi of Fat White Family. Their new album, Forgiveness Is Yours, is out now, and they are also on tour. Liverpool tomorrow night, Manchester Thursday. Further dates at fatwhitefamilymusic.com. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Jonathan Fenby and Marion Messmer, also to Hannah McCarthy at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.